66, Mark 14:66, I think is where we are. Let's read. Mark 14, verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." And again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Verse 72, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. All right, a lot of stuff to unpack here that may not be obvious from the cursory reading of the scripture. So let's dig into it and see how far we can get through all this today. While Peter was below in the courtyard, all right, the meeting of the Sanhedrin then, if Peter was below, then the meeting of the Sanhedrin was above. And where often I have noticed, and you can feedback your experience, in a courthouse, usually the courtroom is on this second floor. I've had the privilege or curse to be in court several times, not for myself, but for others. And very often in these county courthouses, you'll go into the downstairs area, and there's a reception area and meeting rooms. But the courtroom where the judge sits is upstairs. And I don't know if there's any connection between that and this or not, but apparently the trial was in an upper room in this place where the Sanhedrin met, and Peter was downstairs in the courtyard. The building had perhaps a rectangular shape with a courtyard in the middle. Very often they built them that way. And so Peter was below in the courtyard, and one of these servant girls of the high priest came by. She saw Peter, and she said, "You know what? I think you were with that Nazarene. I think you were with him." She looked at him closely. He was standing by the fire with the other people that were milling around. You know, another thing struck me. This is really in the middle of the night, or early in the morning before dawn, before things lighten up, and all these people are active. Of course, there'd been a big arrest, and there was a big trial, so you had 70 members of the Sanhedrin there. And maybe some of their families came with them, or neighbors or friends or curious onlookers, but not me. Mom used to say, nothing ever good ever happens after midnight. In my house, midnight, we're in the bed, asleep. At least I am. Sometimes Marty has trouble getting to sleep. She'll be up late. But to me, that's a little bit of a foreign thing. What's your experience? Do y'all get up and mill around in the middle of the night? Huh? Who? You do? Edna? Really? You and Margie ought to get together. I bet y'all got some stories. Y'all could tell one of some stories, I guess. But anyway, they were out there milling around in the middle of the night. This servant girl saw Peter warming himself at the fire. She looked at him and said, "You know what? You look familiar. I think you were with that Nazarene, that Jesus. You were also here with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. 68, but he denied it. And look what he said. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about." Now, that's the NIV translation. But I'm told by scholars that is a legal statement. If you went into a court of law and you were accused of doing something, this is your first response. Number one, I don't know what you're talking about. And number two, I don't even understand what you're talking about. That disavows any knowledge of what the prosecutor or the judge is trying to accuse you of. So that's what Peter said. That was his answer. Now, he said, and went out into the entryway. That last phrase. Now, if you've got a King James version, or if you've got a CSB version, there's an extra phrase tacked onto the end of it, right? Who's got a King James? What does yours say? In verse 68, and he went out into the entryway and
he went out into the porch, and I don't have my glasses, I'm sorry. And the cock crowed, I think it's
yes.
and the cock crowed or something.
Yes, the rooster crowed.
Okay.
CSB has that phrase too, something like it, right? Not here. It's not in Mark. In fact, the King James, the CSB, I think the NEB has it, but most modern translations do not have that phrase. Huh?
Christian Standard does.
Christian Standard does. Okay, good, thank you.
And your NIV has a little note that says.
The NIV has a note that explains what's going on. But you would expect that, and the prediction back in, where was it where Jesus said that? Okay. Here it is, verse 30. I tell you the truth, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. Mark's the only one that says that. Mark's the only one that says that. All the others say before the rooster crows, which assumes 1 time. But Mark says twice, so if you don't include it there, my response, my question was, before I read the note, was, wait a minute. If you read, where is it? Verse 72, where it says the rooster crowed, you remember the words, the rooster crowed the 2nd time. I said, okay, rooster crowed 2nd. Wait a minute, where was the first time rooster crowed? So you go back and read and say, well, it must have been after he denied Jesus the first time. That would have given Peter a reminder of what Jesus had said. If the rooster's going to crow twice, the first time is a reminder. Giving him a chance to do what? Be a man. To be a man. And not deny him the 2nd time. So, let's see if I can read this note to you that explains it. Yes, here's the note. Some early manuscripts read entryway and the rooster crowed. Some early manuscripts do not have the 2nd time. Some early manuscripts do not have twice. So the way this Bible that you and I love and study and try to understand, and all the versions were put together by interpreters from manuscripts, a bunch of them. If you had written your life story when you were 25 years old, and when you were 30, you said, I really need to update this. So you write another one. When you're 35, you say, this needs to be updated. I forgot about some things, or some things I didn't remember right, or my wife straightened me out on this fact. And so you write another one, and then some of your students, literature students, ask you if they can write a story of your life, and so you give them permission to do that. And so you've got all of these papers in circulation that tell the same story, but they're different. And so when you get down to the day they lay you in the grave and somebody says, you know, we really need to get this right. And they gather all these manuscripts together and they say, well, you know, I don't know. Maybe we should burn all the ones we don't like. Or maybe we should leave them around for later generations to figure out. Or we think this one's right, somebody else thinks that one's right or the best. Somebody else thinks that one's the best. So going down through history then, in the New Testament, and these books and letters that we're studying, there are many versions that were put together, copied, miscopied, pages lost, and Bible scholars and manuscript scholars and critics, not negative critics, positive critics, have to decide when they put out this version of the Bible, which are the best manuscripts. And so the King James Version is limited because it was written so long ago and they didn't have some of the best manuscripts that have been found and determined to be better than the ones that the King James used. And then some other versions, the scholars cannot agree, and these scholars say, well, we think this is probably the best version of the book of Mark. No, this is the best version of the book of Mark. So we wind up with slight differences. Now, I don't think they've ever found any that, or any that have to do with a doctrinal issue. You know, they'd be pretty quick to say, no, we're not going to go with that one. That is contrary to the doctrine of the rest of Scripture. But small things like this, they exist. And so the scholars have to decide which one's the best. And most scholars have come down on the side of, well, we think it really was one cock crow, or the cock crowed just one time. And if you look at Luke and Matthew and John, this is kind of the story we get. But Mark has cock crowing 2 times. And so that's why the NIV has that, and they don't have the first time. So if you run into that, that's the explanation. That's the best one I could find from reading my materials. All right, so we're going to go ahead then. We're not going to get bogged down on it. Maybe we've already got bogged down on it. All right, 69. When the servant girl saw him there, he went out in the street. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. I know he is. He looks like him. He smells like him. He's dressed like him. But he denied it the second time. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter. Now this time it wasn't a servant girl. And that's kind of an interesting patriarchal society, a man's world. And Peter was not educated, of course. He didn't have status, but he was a man, a fisherman, traditionally a big guy. He could stand up to anybody. And this little servant girl has him shaking in his sandals. Ironic, I think. Let's see, we are at verse 70. And he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them. You are a Galilean. All right, look at Matthew 26. Matthew 26. What does Matthew say about that? Matthew 26, verse 73. And some of you probably remember this, and some of you have probably forgotten. Matthew 26, 73. Are you there? After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, now this is a parallel verse to what we just read in Mark. Surely you are one of them, for your accent gives you away. Galileans had a distinctive accent from Judeans. And if you travel south from Galilee into Judah, and you opened your mouth, they knew where you were from. They knew. So the people accused him of being with Jesus because they knew that he was a Galilean. And Matthew tells us the reason they knew he was a Galilean was because of his accent. Peter just should have kept his mouth shut. Kept it shut. 71. He began to call curses down on himself. And he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. He said, I'll be if I'm the man, if I know the man. God condemn me if I know the man. I'm calling curses down from heaven onto himself. Pretty dangerous thing to do anytime, but especially if you're lying, as Peter was. Verse 72, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Big old guy, fisherman, tough. Knew he had failed the master that he had sworn to defend and never fall away. The message here for us is, if Peter can fail, I can fail. If Peter can fail God, I can fail God. And if Peter can be forgiven by God and by Jesus, I can be forgiven. Mark was writing this to who? Who was he writing it to? The people. Church in Rome. What was happening to the church in Rome? They were being persecuted. I mean, if someone stands you up, puts your family in front of you, and says, renounce Jesus, or we're going to slice your family apart one finger at a time, what are you going to do? Most of us would. Most of us would recant. So Mark's writing to them, say, listen, Peter failed. If Peter can fail, you can fail. But Peter was forgiven. And if Peter's forgiven for his failure, then you can be forgiven too. It's an important message. Hold firm, hold firm, hold firm. But if he just can't do it, you're in good company. Let's see. Look at 8:29. Mark 8:29. This is Mark's confession of who Jesus is. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Christ. The big and bold Peter. Knew Jesus was the Christ. Knew Jesus was Lord, and here he is. Will not admit to knowing him. Now, one little insert here that Dr. Brooks, I'm going to read you some from Dr. Brooks a little while. Said Mark does not explain how Peter escaped from the hostile crowd. He was surrounded by hostility. He was surrounded by people that wanted to brand him a supporter of this blasphemer. How did he get away? He already been identified 3 times, and they're all around him. Mark doesn't tell us. Let's go ahead. Jesus before Pilate, very early in the morning. Now this would be Friday morning, right? Very early on Friday morning, The chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. Now, they had this illegal, in many ways illegal, trial during the night, and they decided that Jesus had to die. But the law said that you could not condemn a man at night. You could only do it during the daytime. So that's what they did. Early in the morning, they reached this decision. They condemned Jesus. They bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Now, did Pilate care anything about blasphemy? No. He was a political military ruler. He didn't care about the Jews' religion or their law, Jewish religious law. So by handing him over to Pilate, they got to come up with another charge. Blasphemy is not going to cut it. Pilate would just laugh at him. You go ahead and do your whatever your law. Don't bother me with this stuff. So they got to come up with a new charge. Look at verse 2 in chapter 15. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. That's what they had changed the charge to. No longer were they charging him with blasphemy, because that wasn't going to cut him wasn't going to hold any water with Pilate. They had to come up with something Pilate would be interested in, and Pilate would be alarmed about, and that Pilate would give a sentence of death about. Because if you declared yourself king of a people that were ruled by Rome, that's treason, that's insurrection, and the Romans dealt harshly with people accused or convicted of being insurrectionists. So Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Now this is the first time this title has been used in the book of Mark. Son of Man, Son of God, Messiah, Christ. Never, though, the king of the Jews. That's important. Because to be the king of the Jews, you had to have your own kingdom, independent of Rome. In the NIV, Jesus replied, yes, it is as you say. The CSB says, you say so. And Dr. Brooks explains that the NIV translation is too positive for the Greek, the meaning of the Greek. The meaning of the Greek that Mark wrote is non-committal. It's a non-committal answer. Well, it's just like the CSB said, well, you say I'm king of the Jews. Not, yes, I'm king of the Jews, as the NIV says. So Jesus gave a non-reply. He basically deferred to Pilate's charge rather than defending himself. Verse 3, the chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of? Verse 5, but Jesus still made no reply. And Pilate was amazed. No reply. Look at Psalm 38. Back in the middle of your Old Testament. Fairly easy to find. Psalm 38, verse 13. 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. 38, 18. I confess my iniquity. Is that right? 13. I like that better. I am like a deaf man who cannot hear, like a mute who cannot open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, whose mouth can offer no reply. Scholars see this response of Jesus being a fulfillment of this scripture in Psalms. Look at Isaiah 53. Isaiah is behind Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Isaiah chapter 53, which we know is that great messianic chapter which tells us all about Jesus. Isaiah 53, verse 4. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Whoops, I must have done something wrong. Yes, thank you very much. I just got to keep reading. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Rather than defending himself, as he certainly had the right to do, this was his time. This was the plan that God had laid out for his life and for our salvation. Why would Jesus defend himself against God's plan? Verse 6. Now it was the custom of the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. All right, this custom that they're referred to here, evidently, there's no information outside of Scripture about this custom, and so scholars are supposing that Pilate had worked out this deal with the religious leaders in order to help keep the peace and to pacify these detestable Jewish people and Jewish religious leaders, that they would release at the Passover, this festival of the Passover, someone from Roman imprisonment and let them go as a gesture of goodwill from the good folks in Rome, and who were very, very interested in not having riots, disturbing the peace in Jerusalem. So apparently Pilate and the religious leaders had worked out, and it had become a custom. Pilate was a procurator in the area from 26 AD to about 36 AD. So this is in the time period that was done, Jesus' death. So the custom was already established, and Jesus became enfolded into that custom that they had. A couple of other interesting things here. Barabbas. You know what Barabbas means? Bar, B-A-R, at the beginning of a Jewish name meant son of. What's A-B-B-A? Father or dad. So Barabbas is merely saying son of dad, son of father, father's son. Which is very interesting, because who was Jesus? He was the Son of God. So you've got the son of a father being exchanged for the Son of God. Is that irony or what? You just can't make this stuff up. A man called Barabbas, the son of a father, was in prison with the insurrectionists. who had committed murder in the uprising. Do you know what the Romans do to insurrectionists? They hang them on a cross. So Jesus was being accused, of course, as being an insurrectionist. And he was going to be crucified. That's what the religious leaders wanted. What about Barabbas? As far as the Romans are concerned, Barabbas was a true, genuine insurrectionist who had helped to lead a rebellion against the Romans, and in doing so, he had committed murder, and he probably killed some Romans or soldiers. Barabbas deserved to be crucified from a Roman point of view. Jesus, though, on trumped up charges, you see the irony? The real insurrectionist was freed so that the non-insurrectionists would be crucified. Huh? He died for Barabbas. Literally, there was an exchange. Of course, he died for you and me too. There's an exchange there. The great exchange, as scholars call it. Theologians call it the great exchange. Jesus and being exchanged for us. So there's an exchange going on right here. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas. Now, if the Jewish people hated Roman occupation, they hated everything about it. Taxes, soldiers, loss of freedom, obedience to laws they didn't care anything about, very oppressive. So the crowd had a legitimate reason for insurrectionists. They were heroes. An insurrectionist against Rome was a hero for the crowd. So the chief priests were smart, because the crowd would want Barabbas released because he was on their side against Rome. And had no problem whipping the crowd up into a frenzy to convince Pilate that the judicious thing to do was to find Jesus guilty and to turn Barabbas loose. Verse 12. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? You call the King of the Jews. You call him the King of Jews. I don't call him the King of Jews. You call him the King of Jews. Pilate detested the Jewish people. He detested his assignment in Judah. He came over to the festival only because there was a danger of trouble. Every year. He lived over on the coast of the Mediterranean, Caesarea. That's where the headquarters was. But he would come over to Jerusalem at these festivals to make sure that nothing got out of control. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? Crucify him, they shouted. This is Mark's first use of that term. Verse 14, why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent of the charge. Pilate knew that Barabbas was guilty of the charge. The innocent died for the guilty. You and I are guilty of the charge. No matter where it is, we're guilty. Jesus is not guilty. He who was without sin. Jesus died for us, just like he died for Barabbas. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Verse 15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He was weak. Pilate was weak. He was more interested in politics than in justice. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, Mark, that's the only mention by Mark other than Jesus' predictions. That's the only mention by Mark of the flogging. Of course, if you've seen the music Passion of Christ, movie Passion of Christ, there's a big deal about the flogging because it's so horrendous. So horrendous. And this is not the flogging that the Jews used in enforcing their religious law. They had whipping that was regulated in the Old Testament law. You could give a man 40 lashes for breaking certain laws in Judaism. Couldn't give him any more than 40. And typically they would only give him 39 lashes in case somebody miscounted. They wanted to cover themselves. But that wasn't a flogging like the Roman flogging. They just used a whip. 39 lashes. Nobody died from it. It was very painful, yeah. Taught you a lesson, yeah. You didn't want to do it again, yeah. Flogging was intended as brutal torture. It wasn't so that you wouldn't do it again. You were going to die anyway. But you were going to die a long, slow death, preceded by this extremely, extremely painful whipping, in which very often the skin and muscle and tissue on your back and your sides was flayed away from the bone. And if the flogger was really good, he could get it around your side and rip open your abdomen such that your entrails were exposed. Ugly, ugly, ugly. And Mark did not think it was important or necessary to go into that because everybody knew what a Roman flogging was. Everybody knew. But that's what it was. So they handed him over to be crucified. Look at Mark 10:34. Mark 10:34. Tell you what, let's do 33. Mark 10:33. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him. Jesus knew what it was to be flogged by the Romans. And he set his face toward Jerusalem. He had a date with a flogging. Look at Isaiah 53:5. If you don't have a marker, you probably just go ahead and put your marker in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53:5. But he was pierced for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Horrible wounds. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Let's see. Let's go ahead. Verse 16. The soldiers led Jesus away. Now, Mark does not spend time on the flogging. He goes right on by it to the crucifixion. It did happen. Mark says it happened, but he didn't spend time on it. The soldiers led Jesus away to the place that is the praetorium and called together the whole company of soldiers. Okay, the Praetorium was part of Herod's castle. Big complex of buildings, very luxurious, very ornate, a lot of money. And whenever Pilate came to town, that's where his headquarters was, in Herod's castle. So they took him to a place in the castle called the Praetorium. Also, the word here is palace. And the whole company of soldiers. Now, strictly defined, a company is 100 soldiers. But very often a company contained as many as 200 to 600 soldiers. So there are a bunch of soldiers there. No getting away. No riding in like Robin Hood and his hardy band of followers and rescuing Jesus. It ain't gonna happen. So the soldiers led him away to the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and said, you ever gotten stuck by a thorn? I mean a pyrocantha. First of all, they're about that long, and they're coated with a chemical that gives it that name, pyro, fire. You get one of those in you, and you feel like you've got a hot ice pick in you. Ask me how I know that. Twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. Now, I don't know if this is pyrocantha or not, but I wouldn't be at all surprised. The Romans delighted in these things. They were not nice people. Verse 18, and they began to call to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again, they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Okay, you got a staff. A staff is that big around, maybe? You use for walking or directing the travel of animals or beating off bandits or enforcing the law. And it says they beat him on the head with a staff. Ears, nose, jaw, teeth, eyes, scalp, neck. Beat him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes. Then they led him out to crucify him. All right. Look at 10:34 again. We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him. Jesus knew this mocking was coming. It wasn't a surprise to him. Look at Micah chapter 5. Micah is Old Testament. It's toward the end. It's right after Jonah. If you find Jonah, you can find Micah. Micah chapter 5, verse 1. Marshal your troops, O city of troops. For a siege is laid against us. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. Fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Look at Isaiah chapter 50. This is not 53, but it's lead up to 50. There are 4 servant songs in Isaiah. 53 is a culmination of those servant songs. The most graphic. Isaiah 50, verse 6. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. You see fulfillment of the prophecy and what's going on here. Isaiah 53, back to that great chapter. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Fulfillment, Old Testament prophecy. Look at Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is the kind of the partner to Isaiah 53. Psalm 22. Psalm 22, verse 6. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Now that's a Messiah. You recognize it's been a Messiah text, right? Verse 8. Sure you do. I've got Messiah text marked all through my Bible. I'm a musician, okay? All right, let's go ahead. I think Isaiah 53:3, did we do that? I think we did. All right, so they were mocking him. Not only were they flogging him, ripping the flesh from his bones, not only were they beating him on the head with a rod, but they were mocking him. Insults. Verse 21, a man from Cyrene. Now Cyrene was a prominent city in Libya. Libya is northern Africa, right up on the Gulf of Mexico. Omar Gaddafi. Huh?
Mexico?
Did I say Mexico?
A few miles from Mexico.
Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, Libya. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. And they forced him to carry the cross. Now Jesus started out, we know from other Gospels, Jesus started out carrying the cross. The cross bar, not the vertical part, but the cross bar. Usually the vertical part of the cross stayed in the ground at the place of execution. And the condemned person just carried the crossbar, which had if you look at some movies, I think they probably got it right, had a metal attachment which attached to the vertical bar. The bar weighed probably 20 to 30 pounds. Jesus was in such bad shape, though, that even if you started carrying it, you probably couldn't make it the whole way. And that's what happened here. He was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. All right, let's stop and talk about Simon just for a second. Look at Romans chapter 6. What's Romans got to do with Curious Station? Where are you going to find out? Romans chapter 6. Verse 8. Six, 8. That's not what I want. Yeah, I've got 16:13 too. What is 8 through 10? Let's look at 8 through 10. I put it here for a reason. Now, if we died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. For we know that since Christ was raised from the dead, he cannot die again. Death no longer has mastery over him. The death he died to sin once for all. But the life he lives, he lives to God. In the same way, count yourselves dead to sin, but live to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer the parts of your body to sin as instruments of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer the parts of your body to him as instruments of righteousness. For sin shall not be master, because you are not under law, but under grace. Now, I don't know why I have that there. I don't know why. I beg your forgiveness. Romans 16, though, I know is right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that passage, but I don't know why I had it in at this time. Obviously, I messed up something. Romans 16, verse 13. Remember, we studied this last year. Romans 16, 13. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Who wrote this? Paul. Who did he write it to? The Romans. Who did Mark write his gospel to? The Romans. Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Paul, in his greetings, said, say hi to Rufus for me, would you? Oh, say hi to his mother too, because she treated me like a son. She's been a mother to me. Scholars think there's a high probability that Rufus, the son of Simon of Cyrene, is the same as the Rufus whose mother was a mother to Paul somewhere along the way. Could have been Jerusalem, could have been Ephesus, could have been Corinth, could have been where, we don't know. And they had made their way to Rome. Paul heard about, knew about it, and so he includes them in his greeting. Is it just coincidence? Or is it evidence? Along with the fact that Mark mentioned these three names in his gospel. You don't mention someone's name unless it's going to mean something. So there's a strong possibility then that Alexander and Rufus, or at least Rufus, maybe Alexander, and maybe Simon, all became believers at some point along the way. Certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry his cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Anybody got Calvary? Seems like King James got Calvary. Let me read you a little from Dr. Brooks. Let's see. Stupid stuff. Okay, here we go. Few words are more common in modern Christian vocabulary than Calvary. And few have less justification. The word does not appear in any Greek manuscript of the Gospels or in most modern English translations. It appears in the King James Version and the New King James Version only in Luke 23:33, where for some unexplained reason the translators used an anglicized version of the Latin word Calvaria, which appears regularly in the Vulgate. The Vulgate is a Latin version of the Bible, rather than the English word skull to translate the Greek word cranion, K-R-A-N-I-O-N, cranium, skull. Elsewhere, they properly employ skull to translate cranium. So only in the King James Version will you find the word Calvary. The reason so many of us know the word Calvary and so many hymns and things reference Calvary because it's in the King James, in the book of Luke, but not anywhere else. All right, so they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Look at Hebrews 13:12. Hebrews 13:12. You remember who wrote Hebrews? We don't know. That's a trick question. Hebrews 13:12. Hebrews 13:12. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate. Calvary was located, the place of execution, the skull, was located outside the gate of the city. Look at John 19:20. John 19:20. John 19:20. Let's go 19. John 19:19. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. All right, so Golgotha then, the place where Jesus was crucified, was outside the city wall, but not too far outside the city wall. Probably along a road, so that passers-by could see what happens to insurrectionists. Place of the skull. Verse 23, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. All right, let's look at this wine mixed with myrrh. Wine, of course, if it's got alcohol in it, and that's what makes it wine, will alleviate pain, correct? Myrrh also would alleviate pain. 258. Here we go. Romans flogged their victims to make death as painful as possible. Probably the they in this sentence, verse 23, was then probably Jews rather than Romans offering him wine mixed with myrrh. It was probably some Jews who offered him wine mixed with myrrh in order to help alleviate his suffering. The Babylonian Talmud records a tradition that the women of Jerusalem, perhaps in response to Proverbs 31, 6 through 7. Got to go there. 31, 6 through 7, Proverbs. Proverbs is after Psalms. Proverbs 31, 6 through 7. Proverbs 31, 6 through 7. Give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. So possibly in fulfillment of that scriptural admonition, this group of women would offer wine with myrrh added to it to the condemned in order to deaden their pain somewhat. But he did not take it. Why did he not take it? Teetotaler. No. He thought it was important for him to have the full experience. His suffering would not be diminished by his own choice. If God chose to diminish his suffering, yeah, but not by his own choice. Verse 24, and they crucified him, dividing up his clothes. Our time is up. They cast lots to see what each would get. All right, clothing was expensive in those days, and so it was not unexpected that someone such as a Roman soldier who got paid peanuts would be interested in the clothes of the condemned. But this also fulfills Scripture. Let's see if I can find that. Oh yeah, Psalm 22:18. Remember we talked about 22 being a companion passage to Isaiah 53. Psalm 22, Psalm 22:18. Are you there? They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Bam! The fulfillment of Scripture. And we will pick up right there next week. And maybe we'll finish the book of Mark next week. Okay? See ya. Careful on those wet roads. We're going to take about a 3-month break. No, we're going to go into 1 John, the letter, not the gospel. Over in the back of the New Testament, fascinating, wonderful book, 1 John. All righty.